I've been growing increasingly frustrated with the way the Spider-Man fandom talks about current Amazing Spider-Man comics. I think it's time I pushed back, because what I'm seeing isn't criticism. As far as I'm concerned, it's something worse. Because the way people talk about the state of the comics on social media might make you think that The Amazing Spider-Man is the worst it's ever been and it will never recover from this, so Marvel might as well just cancel the entire series. And I'm not even being hyperbolic with that statement. I've seen that exact sentiment expressed multiple times. There are people who would rather see Marvel cancel Amazing Spider-Man than try to fix things. So I'm going to cover some general grievances I have and then get into my issues with some of the more specific complaints I've seen expressed from the fandom. And I promise you there is a point I'm going to make with all of this. I just ask that you bear with me while I make my way to it. Hello and welcome to the Chemist's Codex. My name is Peter and I enjoy telling stories about the things that catch my interest because I believe those stories can teach us more about ourselves. Now, this is a different style of video than I usually make. I'm pulling back the facade a bit more because I think this topic warrants it, and these are my genuine thoughts and feelings about the current state of Amazing Spider-Man comics. Those who know me will know that I love Spider-Man as a character. He's easily my favorite fictional character of all time. Because, there's just something about a nerdy scientist named Peter that I find relatable. And over the past several years, I've noticed that certain parts of the Spider-Man fandom tend to be overly cynical towards the comics. It feels like no matter what happens, these people will hate it with a white-hot rage. But before I start diving into the criticisms, complaints, and controversies, I want to make a couple things clear. I'm not saying that every person is saying every single one of these points. So if you don't do or say one of the things I mention, then I'm not talking about you. I'm also not saying you can't dislike things or criticize the comics. There are plenty of things to dislike and there are plenty of things to criticize. I just think the vast majority of what I'm going to talk about in this video come from a place of bad faith. So let's start off with something that's more broad, just to ease into things. This is a problem that stems from what I believe to be people not actually reading the comics they're complaining about. And I'm not saying you have to read the comics to be a fan of Spider-Man. There's enough media that you can absolutely be a fan of the character without reading the comics. What I am saying is that if you want to criticize the comics, then you kind of have to actually read them. As just one example, I've seen several people across various social media platforms say that they haven't read Amazing Spider-Man since One More Day happened. And if you're someone who hasn't read ASM since then, that's fine, but I'm not going to care about what you have to say regarding the current comics that are being published. Or there are two specific cases of controversy in recent years that I also want to address, and I believe these controversies stem from people taking a single panel out of context because they don't read the comics. The first happened just a few months ago. It was the whole debacle about Miles Morales being called Spin instead of Spider-Man. And this isn't the worst thing to be upset about because there is a notable portion of people who insist that only Peter is Spider-Man and Miles can never be Spider-Man. A sentiment that often appears to stem from bigotry and racism, so the cause for upset wasn't unwarranted as it could be seen as Marvel trying to appease those people. However, it also seemed like people were ignoring the larger context, only choosing to focus on this panel and the fact that Miles was called Spin, because this panel comes from Radioactive Spider-Man number 2, which was a tie-in comic to an X-Men event that takes place 10 years in the future as part of an alternate timeline. So already, it's not even a main continuity story, and this is where I believe a lot of the people upset over this didn't actually read the comic, because it is made very clear that Miles and Peter had some sort of falling out prior to the events of this comic. So this isn't even a case of Miles not being worthy of the Spider-Man title. No, this is a case of the Spider-Man name not being worthy enough for Miles, because in Miles' eyes, the man who originated that name has betrayed everything it should stand for. But then the second controversy is even worse in regards to not reading the comic, because once again, it seemed to be people taking a single panel out of context, but this time the exact same panel provides the reasoning to not get upset. This happened a few years ago. The issue in question is Amazing Spider-Man Volume 6, number 20. While part of the Zeb Wells era, this issue was actually written by Joe Kelly. At this point in time, Peter is dating Felicia Hardy, the Black Cat, because Mary Jane is currently with you-know-who. Don't worry, I'll get to it. Felicia is trying to get Peter to admit that he still loves Mary Jane, and Peter does eventually concede and admit that he still loves MJ. Like a sister. And that's what made people upset. I saw so many people freaking out over Peter saying MJ is like a sister to him, and if that was it, I would agree, because that's kind of weird. But again, this is where I think the people who were upset didn't actually read the comic. Because in the exact same panel where Peter says this, Felicia immediately calls him on his bullshit. At which point Peter then admits that yes, he loves Mary Jane and he always will, but that love has shifted. it's become less intense, especially since Peter's been dating Felicia. And hopefully this helps to illustrate the point I made before. If you want to criticize the comics in any meaningful way, then you have to actually read the comics. You can't just find a screenshot of the panel online or trust what someone else says. But I also mentioned One More Day when I first made that point. So let's talk about that story in particular, because even though that story came out almost 20 years ago, I still see people bitching and moaning about it. And just so everyone's on the same page, I'll give you some context. One More Day is an infamous story which takes place in the aftermath of the Civil War event. Peter revealed his identity, which caused Wilson Fisk, the Kingpin, to hire an assassin to kill him. However, the bullet ended up hitting Aunt May instead as Peter dodged out of the way. In order to save Aunt May's life, Peter tries seeking help from the likes of Tony Stark, Reed Richards, and Doctor Strange. However, they all say that there is nothing they can do for him. So Mephisto, the Marvel Universe's devil, approaches Peter with an offer. Mephisto will save Aunt May's life and erase the entire world's memory of Peter being Spider-Man, but in return, Peter and Mary Jane must sacrifice their marriage. After the couple discuss the matter, Peter reluctantly accepts the deal, making it so he and Mary Jane were never married. The general consensus regarding One More Day is that it's the worst thing to ever happen to Spider-Man ever, full stop, period. And I do agree that it's not great. I want Peter and MJ to be together, and it is pretty shitty that people in charge at Marvel think you can't tell interesting Spider-Man stories unless Peter is single. And it's also kind of bullshit how Stark, Richards, and Strange couldn't do anything to help. But the story happened. Get over it. It's been almost 20 years. Why are we still complaining about this? But there is one complaint regarding One More Day that I don't agree with. That being when people claim Peter's choice was selfish. And I do understand where that argument comes from, but it feels like a very surface level understanding of a complaint to me. Because remember, Aunt May ended up getting shot as a direct result of Peter's actions. If she dies, then Peter would never be able to stop blaming himself for her death. So if Peter doesn't take Mephisto's deal, Aunt May dies. Yes, he's still married, and the support from Mary Jane could help him live with May's death, but that doesn't change the fact that May is still dead. But if Peter does take the deal, no one dies. Sure, he and MJ never got married, and the bond between them is now significantly weaker, but no one had to die. And that's why I think Peter made the more responsible choice in his eyes. I don't see it as Peter taking the deal because he didn't want to deal with the guilt or because he was being selfish. I think Peter accepted the deal because that's the way no one dies. He was willing to sacrifice a piece of himself to keep Aunt May alive. And that's a very Spider-Man thing to do. But now let's turn to some of the comments I've seen regarding the Brand New Day era, which immediately followed the One More Day story. I think these complaints are largely either misconceptions or bad faith readings of the comics. For starters, there seems to be a good number of people who believe that Peter was de-aged in this era, and that's just entirely untrue. Now, it is true that Peter's exact age has been vague for a while now, but that can be said about every character in the Marvel Universe, because Marvel uses a sliding timescale for their main continuity. So everything that happened in the comics between Fantastic Four #1 and now takes place in the span of about 15 to 20 years. And the thing is, time progression and ages of characters are just not really that relevant. Time still progresses, just at a much slower rate that continues to get slower and slower. Like it or don't, that's just how it works. But this does segue nicely into another complaint that I commonly hear about this era, the idea that they made Peter a man-child. And the thing is, I find this to be a baseless claim. I've only ever seen people make the claim that Marvel turned Peter into a man-child, but I've never seen anyone give examples of how. I think at this point this particular complaint has been said by so many people so many times that now it's just regurgitated whenever someone wants to complain about the Brand New Day era. But then moving out of Brand New Day and into everything that's happened since One More Day, there are a couple more common complaints I want to address. Firstly is the claim that Marvel is keeping Peter in a cycle of constant regression. They build him up only to tear him down, and the way people talk about this, you would think it's happening all the damn time. But by my count, I can only think of 3 instances when this has happened since One More Day. And I'm also counting One More Day. So there's One More Day, that's 1. Then there's the fall of Parker Industries, that's 2. And then there's the whole situation with MJ and He Who Shall Not Be Named. Again, I'll get to it, and that's 3. So 3 major falls within the past 20 years. That's not really that much. I think this is, again, a case of people regurgitating an opinion that someone posted online without really taking the time to think about it. But this particular complaint seems to stem from a larger comment about Marvel refusing to let Peter or any of the other characters grow as characters, which is a claim that I wholeheartedly disagree with. Because what I've noticed about this particular claim is that very frequently, when someone is complaining about Marvel not letting Peter grow, what they're really complaining about is how Marvel isn't letting Peter get married to MJ and having kids. And while that is definitely something I want for Peter Parker and something the character also clearly wants for himself, that is not the only way for a character to grow. Because Peter is the type of character who takes something away from every situation he finds himself in. It is still possible for Peter to grow as a result of failure, and I would argue those moments of growth are often the best. Because finding a steady job, getting married, and having kids isn't the world we live in anymore. People might have a different job every few years, and that's if they can even find a job. People can reach a point in their life where it feels like everything is perfect and nothing can ever tear them down, only to have it all fall apart and come crashing down around them. So having Peter go through these same things is entirely realistic and gives Peter the opportunity for genuine growth. And now I want to talk about Mary Jane, but before I can do that, I have to talk about... I told you I would get to it. Because the way people talk about Paul on social media, you would think he's a vile, horrendous, terrible, awful, no good, scum of the earth, devil-worshipping lunatic. Paul is such a hated character, and I just don't think he's worth the level of hate he gets. And I'm not saying I like Paul. I dislike him just as much as the next guy, but he's such a nothing character. I don't think he's worth all the hate. And I also find a lot of the claims people make regarding Paul to be unfounded and largely hearsay, having been obscured and overblown by the level of hatred towards the character. But for some context, let me explain this whole Paul situation. It actually starts back during the Brand New Day era. Zeb Wells wrote a short arc which introduced the character of Dr. Benjamin Rabin. Dr. Rabin is a mathematician who has figured out how to use what I refer to as Mayan math magic in order to summon an evil deity wanting to become a god himself. Of course, Rabin is defeated, but now we fast forward to the end of the Beyond storyline. Rabin has escaped from his imprisonment and has come to fight Spider-Man. During the initial fight, Peter and Mary Jane are transported to a parallel world where Rabin had succeeded in his quest to become a god. This is where Peter and MJ meet Paul, seemingly the only survivor of this world, and also someone who worked with Rabin, not knowing the madman's ultimate goal. Paul helps create a device that can transport Peter and MJ back to their world. However, they are attacked and MJ pushes Peter through the portal, sacrificing herself. Peter then immediately starts thinking of how to get back to save MJ, but he quickly discovers that time moves significantly faster in the parallel world, so he can't take his time to do things the right way. Peter ends up alienating most of his friends and loved ones, spending the next 3 days working to get back to MJ. Forgoing sleep and getting help from Norman Osborn, Peter is able to get back to the parallel world. But Peter learns that MJ has been in that world for nearly 4 years and has grown close to Paul, and that the two of them have adopted 2 abandoned children they had come across. It's also revealed that Paul isn't just a random guy who worked with Rabin, Paul is actually his son. Of course, this was all revealed after the fact, about 20 issues into Zeb Wells' run. The run starts with everyone mad at Peter and Mary Jane in our relationship with Paul. It honestly feels like you missed several issues, and it doesn't feel good. The reader is left in the dark without any sort of explanation why any of this is the way it is. And I think this is where a lot of the hate for Paul comes from. He just kind of showed up with no explanation. I think if we had seen everything play out from the beginning, then, well, Paul still would have been hated, but I think he would have been hated to a lesser extent. So now that we have the context, let's get into a claim about Paul as a character that I see pretty frequently. That being the claim that Paul is a self-insert character, which as far as I can tell, is entirely false. Firstly, who is Paul supposed to be a self-insert for? I've seen claims that he's a self-insert for Zeb Wells, since Wells was writing Amazing Spider-Man when the character was introduced. I've also seen claims that Paul is a self-insert for Nick Lowe, the current executive editor for Spider-Man comics. I've even seen the claim that Paul is a self-insert for Marvel editorial as a whole. Second, why do we need Paul to be a self-insert? I've seen claims that regardless of who they think Paul is a self-insert for, Paul exists to play out whoever's fantasy of being with Mary Jane. And my response to that is, you don't need a self-insert to do that. Seriously, wouldn't it be so much easier to live out a fantasy of being with Mary Jane by just keeping her and Peter together? Isn't Peter meant to be such a relatable character that practically anyone can see themselves in him? So why does Paul need to exist for this fantasy? Also, there's never been any sort of confirmation from any of the people who created the comics featuring Paul that he's a self-insert. He also doesn't even look like any of the people he's supposedly a self-insert for. But okay, let's talk about Mary Jane Watson now, because with the Paul situation, there have also been a lot of comments about Mary Jane's character. There's the idea that Mary Jane betrayed Peter by getting together with Paul. I disagree with that claim, because remember, for Mary Jane, it had been nearly 4 years since she last saw Peter. As far as she could know, Peter was dead. Then when you factor the 2 kids into things, it becomes clear that if Mary Jane left them the second Peter shows up, then she would have been in the wrong. And frankly, having gone back and reread all these issues, I never actually got the impression that Mary Jane loved Paul like she did Peter. We never see them being all that close to each other. At most, we see them sharing a bed, and there's one instance of MJ giving Paul a peck on the cheek. Then the only evidence we really have of them being intimate with each other is when Paul questions their lack of intimacy after he finds out she's now Venom, which is another thing I'll get to shortly. And throughout Wells' run of Amazing Spider-Man, it constantly felt like MJ wanted to go back to Peter, that she wants to be with him, but due to the circumstances she's found herself in, she is unable to, because she has to think about more than just herself. A great example of this comes after Robin is truly defeated and MJ tries her hand at being a superhero. She and Peter team up to fight some bad guys, and afterwards, Peter comments on how good it feels to be teaming up and how great of a team they make. And MJ responds by saying that he's right, and because he's right, they can't team up again, because MJ knows that if they do, she'll be unable to keep her feelings for Peter under control. And then in a team-up book MJ had with Black Cat, there's a moment where MJ uses a wrecking ball to emulate the boulder from Indiana Jones, and her thought during that sequence is, wait until Peter hears about this. Or right before Hellgate shows up in the current run, there's a small scene where we cut to MJ as she's thinking about Peter. All of this tells me that MJ does want to be with Peter. She's constantly thinking about him and what he would do and what advice he would give her. As far as I'm concerned, it's only a matter of time before Peter and MJ are back together. But now let's talk about Mary Jane currently being Venom, because this is something else that I've seen a lot of discourse about. The main complaint I see regarding Marvel's decision to make MJ Venom has to do with the idea that it's a betrayal of her character. This is largely due to MJ having been traumatized to the point of tears by the Venom symbiote in one of Venom's early appearances. And while that is a fair point to make, it also kind of baffles me, because it seems to contradict the comment of there being no growth for the characters. Venom has changed a lot since their first appearance, and Mary Jane having no other choice than to bond with the symbiote shows a distinct growth of her character. Mary Jane is not letting herself be defined by her trauma. She is confronting the very source of that trauma and growing past it. That is clear and obvious character growth. Oh, but I forgot, the only growth that people want is Peter and MJ getting married and having kids. And frankly, I've been enjoying MJ's foray into being a superhero, both as Jackpot and as Venom. And from my perspective, MJ having real experience as a superhero is a great development for the character. Because like I said, it's only a matter of time until Peter and MJ get back together, and now that Mary Jane has the experience of being a superhero, she'll be able to better understand and support Peter with what he goes through every day. It might even be that she'll go out and physically help Peter beyond her given moral support. But I think all of these complaints I've been talking about all come back to one thing, and that's people wanting to point at someone they can be angry at. This tends to be Zeb Wells, since he was the writer for the whole Paul thing, or Nick Lowe, the current Spider-Man executive editor, or Tom Brevoort, Marvel vice president of publishing and editing and current X-Men executive editor, or C.B. Cebulski, Marvel's editor-in-chief. And I think this want to put the blame on someone comes from people trying to rationalize why they don't like the current Amazing Spider-Man comics. They want to blame someone for their dislike. They want to point to bad writing or poor editorial decisions. Which again isn't to say you can't criticize the comics, but that's not what I'm seeing. I'm seeing people being mad at the creatives for what really amounts to a difference of opinion. And with the way these people talk about the writers and editors, you would think the creatives made some sort of direct personal attack against them. And I've seen several cases where people point to something a writer or editor said in an interview or in response to a letter or a social media post, etc., as a way to validate their anger towards that person. But I've noticed that they also tend to misrepresent or misinterpret what was said, seemingly going in wanting to find something to be angry at. And that leads me to the ultimate point I want to make with this video. You need to trust that the creators of a comic book do genuinely want to give you a good story, because why would they want to give you a bad one? And I understand that the creatives also need to earn the trust from their readers, but from what I've seen, a lot of the people who make these complaints aren't giving the creatives the space to earn that trust. They go into a comic already hating it simply because of who's making it. And that's not good faith criticism. That's straight up cynicism. These people don't believe that the creatives want to tell a good story. They seem to think that every issue of Amazing Spider-Man that's published exists to serve some sort of selfish goal of the creatives. And the thing is, I've only ever seen this level of sustained hate and anger regarding Peter Parker's Spider-Man. I don't see this level of hatred for Moon Knight, or Daredevil, or the Avengers, or even other spiders like Miles Morales or Spider-Gwen. And that makes me think that most of the complaints and angry comments aren't coming from a place of good faith. Instead, they seem to come from a place of bitterness, because someone has a different idea for a Spider-Man story than they do. It all just feels petty and childish. Because again, there has to be some level of trust that these writers and artists and inkers and colorists and editors want to give us a good story. You don't have to like whatever story they give you, and you are certainly allowed to criticize it, but it doesn't do anyone any good to go into a comic book already deciding you hate it. And just as one final thought, I also get the impression that the people who are making these complaints think they hold the majority opinion. that Spider-Man fans everywhere hate the current comics and they hate editorial for making these comics, and anyone who likes these comics is wrong and an idiot and not a real fan. But I believe that these people are in the minority when it comes to the fans who do read the comics. They are very loud and vocal about their opinions, but they are the minority. I believe most people who read The Amazing Spider-Man month to month tend to like the stories, because they don't have some weird one-sided feud with Spider-Man editorial. And that's also one of the reasons I wanted to make this video. I wanted to push back against what I see as the toxic side of the fandom, because I don't think there are enough people criticizing them, which is why they think they're the majority. And maybe some of those fans will watch this and maybe change their minds. Who knows? I still ask that we all give the comic creators space to earn our trust. Trust that they want to give us a good story. And if you still don't like these comics, that's fine. I'm not the biggest fan of what's been happening these past few years myself, but I keep reading anyway, because I want to know what's going to happen to my all-time favorite character, because I love Spider-Man, and I'm going to stick around. Thanks for watching. And as I'm wrapping up this video, I want to lay down some ground rules for the comments section, because I welcome comments and criticisms about the points I've brought up, but only if they're made in good faith. So first of all, attack my arguments, not me. If you try to attack my person rather than what I said, the comment will be removed. Second, if you're going to make a claim, please give me some sort of evidence for that claim. Don't just call Peter a man-child. Give me specific examples of when and how Peter was a man-child. Or if you want to claim that an editor said something, give me the interview or post or publication where they said it. And these ground rules will also be stated as a pinned comment, because I'm expecting many people won't make it to the end of this video before commenting. And if you liked this video, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. I've got more Spider-Man and Marvel content coming up that you won't want to miss.